True City is a network of churches here in the city that collaborate for the good of the city. And Blessings is on the pathway to becoming an affiliate church of True City. They had their annual conference this weekend. It's now called a festival. And at this festival, they shared a lot of stories of what God is doing in the city. Some of you were able to attend the festival, as I was, and we could hear stories of what God is doing in the city, and many of those stories were very encouraging. Well, there were not only plenary sessions, there were also breakout sessions, and I went to a breakout session on mental health. And the facilitator of this breakout session began the session with this question: can you share with the group positive stories involving the church and mental health? Are there positive stories that you can share about your congregation involving mental health? Now, it was a pretty large group of people, and people were hesitant to talk, and so we were divided into small groups to begin with that question. And as I listened, I discovered that no one who spoke in my particular small group had a positive story to tell. They were all negative stories. They were all disappointing, discouraging stories. It seems that each of the participants in the group that I was in was quite invested in mental health. In some cases, they were individuals who themselves had battled or were battling mental illness. In other cases, they had children or parents with mental illnesses. But they were unhappy with the way that their respective congregations addressed the issue. And what was the complaint? Well, I think there were multiple complaints, but one of them was this: that in their respective church cultures, people are always expected to be happy, excited, confident, optimistic Christians. That was a message that the church was communicating through its sermons, but it's also a message the church was communicating through its songs. You're expected to be a happy Christian. You're expected to come to church composed, eager to sing with joy to the Lord. And yet, if you're somebody who struggles with severe depression, that can be very difficult. If you're somebody who's going through a crisis, that can be hard. If you're in a moment in your life where things are unraveling, that really can't be expected, can it? And somebody in the group said, I wish there was a place in the church for lament. Now, earlier on in the week, if you're a Facebook friend of mine, and if you're not, you're still a friend, I posted something on Facebook that was critical of a lot of contemporary praise music because it misses this dimension of lament. It's not something that we often do when we sing praise songs. They tend to be upbeat. They tend to sound the note of joy and of happiness, of delighting in the Lord. And I had a response, which is typically what happens when you post something on Facebook, from a friend who is a theologian in the Vineyard churches. Now, the Vineyard churches are charismatic churches. This friend of mine is a very profound theologian. He pointed out to me that in the contemporary worship scene, there are a lot of laments that are being composed. The problem is that churches aren't singing them because they're not the kinds of songs that churches typically want to sing. So he waved his finger at me. He said, do not criticize the contemporary worship movement. We're producing songs, critique the church for not choosing them to sing. I don't know if you're familiar with Brian Dirksen. Wrote a wonderful song, The River, probably his most famous song. He's a Vineyard musician, and I went on his website. I noticed that he had numerous songs of lament written for worship that I've never heard of, that we never sing. We've been going through in this sermon series dark psalms, psalms of lament, because we recognize that believers sometimes go through periods of darkness. For some, in fact, life is chronic darkness. And we're discovering that the Bible is not immune to this. The Bible acknowledges this. There are more psalms of lament than there are psalms of praise in the book of Psalms. This morning we're looking at Psalm 55, a particularly dark psalm, perhaps more dark than any psalm we've considered so far. You can sense as you read the psalm, the psalmist's pain. It almost brings you to tears, in fact, if you read it very sensitively. But the interesting thing is that the psalm ends on a kind of encouraging note. It ends, well, towards the end at least, you have this verse that's quoted by Peter in the New Testament. It's a verse with which most of us are familiar. Cast your cares upon the Lord, because he cares for you. And as I reflected on the psalm this morning, I was struck that in many ways that is the central message of the psalm. We want to think about the entire psalm this morning in terms of that one verse. Cast your cares upon the Lord because he cares for you. Here's what I discovered. The word that is translated cares, over time in the Hebrew language, became understood as burdens. But originally, what the word means is what is given. And so John Goldingay, who's an Old Testament scholar, has a 3-volume commentary on the Psalms. He translates that verse, throw at the Lord what you have been given. Throw at the Lord what you have been given. Now, what have you been given? You've been given life. You've been given this world. That may not be a good thing for you. You didn't choose this life, which for you may be a life of suffering. You didn't choose your gender, your sex. You didn't choose your ethnicity. You didn't choose your family. You didn't choose your parents. You didn't choose your country. You didn't choose your city. It's given to you. Throw at the Lord what is given you. I don't know how many of you here this morning are familiar with the German philosopher Martin Heidegger. I know there's at least one person who's familiar with him, probably 2 people, probably 3. Famous German philosopher. And in the history of philosophy, and I know you're so interested to hear this, aren't you? In the history of philosophy, there's a lot of reflection on human existence, but it was often in abstraction. So René Descartes would philosophize about humanity in abstraction. And Heidegger made this distinction between being and being there, Sein in German and Dasein. He said the existence of humanity is not Sein but Dasein. It's being there. It's always situated in a context. It's always embedded in a situation. But he goes on to say something that's very important for us this morning. He says, how do we get Dasein? How do we get to being here or being there? He says, we are thrown into the world. He's not a believing philosopher. We are thrown into existence. Is that a warm idea for you this morning? It's a scary idea, isn't it? We are thrown into existence, and we don't have much of a choice in this connection. What kind of world are we thrown into? Well, we're thrown into a world where there's evil in the city, and you can look at verses 9 through 11 of the psalm and see all the different ways in which the city is evil. There's malice, there's deceit, there's lies, there are crimes. We talk about the beauty of the city of Hamilton often at Blessings, don't we? But there is an ugly side to the city. There's a lot of crime in our city, and we have individuals here at Blessings that have been victims of crime. We have individuals here at Blessings that have been assaulted on the street. We have individuals here in Blessings whose homes have been robbed. And when you're the victim of a crime and you sense that people are out to get you, you want to escape. And that's the plea of the psalmist. Oh, that I had the wings of a dove. I would fly away to another area. How often don't you have that experience? You feel trapped for one reason or another, and you think the only solution is to be lifted from the situation, to be lifted from Dasein and taken somewhere else with the wings of a bird. Well, there's something more disturbing for the psalmist than just the evils of the city. There's the betrayal of a friend. And that's really what the psalm is about, isn't it? He's had a close, confident betrayal. Let's look at some of those verses. Verse 11. If an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend. Verse 20. My companion attacks his friends. He violates his covenant. The psalmist here is talking about other church members. Church members can betray each other. We develop friendships with people, and we expect our friends to help us in our time of need, and sometimes we enter scenarios where we're needy and our friends are nowhere to be found. That's the feeling of betrayal. We feel betrayed by trusted confidants. This is the experience that people have in a broken marriage where one spouse turns against the other. And I'm not just talking about the acrimony that you might expect of a divorce, but of a couple living under the same roof with no intention of ever splitting apart. But one turns against the other, and there's betrayal. Verse 21, his talk is smooth as butter, but war is in his heart. Sounds like a passive-aggressive relationship, doesn't it? You have guys, you have girls who sweet talk their spouses while they're stabbing them in the heart, wounding them. I wonder this morning if you've been betrayed by a close friend. Jesus understands that betrayal. He was betrayed by a close friend. He loved Judas Iscariot. Have no doubt about it. Judas Iscariot was a trusted friend. And he was betrayed, and he had to experience the pain of betrayal. We have people in the church who've been abused. They've been abused by family members. If there's anybody you ought to trust, it's a family member. We have people in the church who've been abused by other church members. In some cases, cannot look certain people in the eye because of mistreatment. And when you go through these kinds of experiences, when you've been mistreated by another person, when you've been abused, what you want more than anything else is justice. You want justice. And that's David's cry in the psalm. It's a cry for justice. He cries out for the Lord to punish the wicked. Verse 9, Lord, confuse the wicked, confound their words. Same terminology, by the way, that you find in the narrative of the Tower of Babel. Verse 15, let death take my enemies by surprise. Let them go down alive to the realm of the dead. Now, these are very visceral pleas, aren't they? They're loaded with emotion. Let death take these people by surprise. It's a plea that's called an imprecation, where you invite God's curses upon people. And I read popular Christian magazines, and I read posts on Facebook once in a while and Twitter. Sometimes I come across this idea that this is a spirituality that's unique to the Old Testament. It's not the spirituality that we find in the New Testament. Because in the New Testament, we're told to turn the other cheek. We're told to love our enemies. We don't find in the New Testament a spirituality where we're calling down curses upon our enemies. We need to adopt, people say, the spirituality of the Apostle Paul in Romans 12, where he says this: if your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. In doing this, you will heap burning coals on his head. Well, the interesting thing about that verse is you find it in the New Testament, but Paul is quoting the Old Testament. And we simply cannot pit Old Testament against New Testament in this area. We are always, as believers, to turn the other cheek. We are always to love our enemies. We are never to take revenge, because vengeance is the Lord's. And because vengeance is the Lord's, we cry out to Him for justice. We say, Lord, right the wrongs of society, right the wrongs in my life, punish those who have mistreated me. We might turn the other cheek to them, but we cry out for the Lord to exact justice on our opponents, on those who mistreat us. Now, if you've never cried out to God for justice, it's because your life has been very easy. I hope I'm not too offensive. If you have never cried out to the Lord for justice, it's because your life has been too easy. One of my favorite theologians is Miroslav Volf. He's actually speaking at McMaster Divinity School this coming Thursday. He is a Croatian theologian who, for a time, lived in Serbia, a place of immense conflict. You had ideological conflict there between Marxists and Christians. You had ethnic conflict between the Serbs and the Croats. And some of you will remember from the 80s, maybe early 90s, ethnic genocide. Croats and Serbs were both responsible. Towns were pillaged. Homes were burned. Girls were raped. Children were killed. And Miroslav Volf wrote a book, Exclusion and Embrace, and he says, you want to tell me that God doesn't punish the wicked? He said, if I didn't believe that God punished the wicked, I would have taken matters into my own hand. To have family members treated that way, I would have taken revenge. The only thing that kept me from taking revenge is knowing that God is a God of justice and He'll mete out punishments. You think that God refuses to judge? Here's what Volf writes about that theology. In a scorched land, soaked in the blood of the innocent, it will invariably die, that theology. And as one watches it die, one will do well to reflect about many other pleasant captivities of the liberal mind. If you've had a child abducted from your home, wouldn't you pray, as the psalmist does in one of the prayers, break the teeth of my enemy? I'm sure you would. Now, there are two ways, biblically speaking, in which a person can die. A person can die by physical death, or a person can be converted to Christ. And I think in the early church, you probably had believers who were saying, Lord, kill Saul. He's persecuting the church. And the Lord answered that prayer. And Saul was killed. And a new Saul came to life, a completely different person. A person now who loved the Lord and who loved the church. And when we ask for the Lord to kill evil, to deal with evil, we leave to Him how He does that. And conversion is one of the ways in which He does it. David prays, throw unto the Lord what is given you. The implication is that our lives are given to us, and what we encounter in life is given to us. Even the abuse that we encounter is given to us. The hostility that we face is given to us. The ugly scenarios in which we are located is given to us. And David offers very interesting counsel here. He basically says, throw back to the Lord what he has thrown at you. Throw back at the Lord what he has thrown at you. And how does David throw back at the Lord? He does it by means of this prayer. He does it by means of these pleas. He does it by means of these laments. And he's acknowledging that the world is not his world, it's the Lord's world. He's acknowledging that justice is not his domain, it's the Lord's domain. That the future is not in his hands, it's in the Lord's hands. Throw back at the Lord what the Lord has thrown at you. But he acknowledges something else, and boy, look at the clock. Is it really 1:45? That's crazy. Oh boy. All right, we'll find a way to wrap this up. Here's the other acknowledgement, verse 22. He will never let the righteous be shaken. That's not just David's theology, that's David's experience. And earlier in the psalm, you could see how he's confident that the Lord will hear him. He never lets the righteous be shaken. I'm finding a way to wrap this up. As I conclude, throw back at the Lord what he has thrown to you in prayer, in lament, in protest. Pray as David does.